At 7 o'clock in the evening, the sun begins to set over the gardens of Versailles, and the character of the palace changes. During the day, government business fills much of the building. Ministers move between offices, petitioners wait in antechambers, and tradespeople deliver goods for a household of several thousand people. At night, that business slows, and a different group of people uses the same rooms. Courtiers who spent the afternoon working or walking in the gardens change into evening dress. Candles are carried into rooms that stood empty an hour before. The corridors that held clerks and footmen that morning now fill with people wearing silk, powder, and jewelry, as several hundred nobles and their attendants turn the rooms used for daytime business into rooms used for evening entertainment. Footmen move from room to room, lighting the first candles of the evening, working through the building well before full darkness, since a room left unlit past dusk is treated at Versailles as a visible failure of service. Dinner is the first fixed point of the night. Since the reign of Louis XIV, the French court has practiced a ritual called the Grand Couvert. The king and queen eat in front of an audience. Any person dressed appropriately, sword and hat included for men, may walk into the room and watch the royal family eat. Ushers check dress at the door, not identity. Inside, the king and queen sit in armchairs with their backs to the fireplace. They are the only people in the room permitted armchairs. Duchesses may sit on a low stool called a tabouret. Princesses of the blood may use a chair with a back but no arms. Everyone else stands. Neither the king nor the queen serves themselves. Reaching for a dish or pouring a glass of water is a task reserved for courtiers of a specific rank, and it is treated as a genuine privilege rather than a chore. Food is served in the style called à la Française, with several dishes set out on the table at once rather than brought course by course. And once the king finishes eating, food that has barely been touched is passed down through the ranks of his officers, who serve it in turn to their own friends and visitors. Marie Antoinette, by most accounts, dislikes the Grand Couvert. She eats little, keeps her gloves on through the meal, and is known to prefer a second, smaller meal served privately in her own rooms afterward. When she does eat that later meal, her preference runs towards something plain: white meat, broth, and a few biscuits dipped in water, closer to what a modern reader would consider a light snack than a formal supper. Early in her reign, she asked for musicians to be placed on a platform in the dining room, so the meal would at least have music to cover the silence and the watching. Toward the end of Louis XV's reign, the full Grand Couvert is held only on Sundays and feast days. On ordinary evenings, the king and queen increasingly prefer a smaller supper for around 40 invited guests, eaten in the dining room of the private apartments, where Sèvres porcelain and silver plate are used in rotation, and the audience of strangers is absent. After supper, entertainment begins, and its exact form depends on where the court is staying and what time of year it is. Card play is close to universal. Louis XIV set aside 3 evenings a week for gambling in his own rooms. By Marie Antoinette's time, the queen hosts a card game most nights, and her rooms draw both players and spectators. The games in fashion include lansquenet, a fast game played for cash; Pharaon, also called Pharaoh, in which players bet against a banker on the order in which cards will be turned over; and quadrille, a 4-player game adapted from the Spanish game ombre, especially popular among the women of the court. Visitors are free to stand and watch a table in progress, and it is not unusual for onlookers to place their own side bets on the outcome without joining the game itself. Marie Antoinette plays for real money and plays often. Early in her reign, she wrote to her mother that a typical weekday evening included about 2 hours of cards, usually starting around 7. As an 18-year-old newly arrived Dauphine, she once won more than 1,000 louis in a single evening of lansquenet, and was embarrassed enough by the size of the win that she gave away most of it the next day, distributing money to the parish churches of Versailles and to her own servants. In other years, she loses more than she wins. She's also a committed billiards player, competing in her own apartments with enough enthusiasm and enough money-changing hands that the king's concern extends beyond the card tables to the billiard table as well. Louis XVI, worried about both the example being set and the debts accumulating in his wife's apartments, eventually banned some of the more ruinous games from being played at court. The ban is not fully effective, and professional gamblers continue finding their way into the Queen's Card evenings regardless. Music runs on many of the same evenings as the cards, rather than replacing them. Marie Antoinette plays harp and harpsichord, studies harp under Philip Joseph Hinner from her late teens, and takes singing and harpsichord lessons from the opera composer Christoph Willibald Gluck, whose work she supports throughout her time in France. She also promotes composers such as André-Ernest Modeste Grétry, who becomes her personal harpsichord teacher, and Antonio Cecchini. She composes small pieces of her own, mostly songs for voice and harp, and keeps several elaborately decorated harps in her rooms. Concerts are sometimes given directly in her bedchamber, for a small audience of courtiers standing or seated around her while she plays. She also follows the Concert Spirituel, a public concert series that brings professional musicians from Paris into the orbit of the court, extending her interest in music beyond whatever her own household happens to be performing that night. Balls are less frequent than cards or music, but occupy a different scale entirely. From around the middle of the 1770s, masked balls are regularly held in the Hall of Mirrors. The gallery, lit on an ordinary evening by a modest number of candles for people passing through, is transformed for these occasions. Candles are placed in wall sconces on standing torchères and in 43 silver chandeliers, and their light is multiplied by the hall's 357 mirrors. Historical accounts describe balls burning through more than 20,000 candles in a single night. One ball in 1739 reportedly required around 24,000, and a celebration for a royal birth in 1751 used about 8,000, though that particular arrangement was considered a failure because the candelabras were hung too high and cast unflattering shadows on the ladies underneath. This level of light is not maintained night to night. The extra chandeliers and torchères are installed for the occasion and dismantled afterward by the department responsible for court spectacle. Guests wear masks, dance, gamble, and move between adjoining rooms until early morning. The masks are a matter of etiquette more than true disguise. Most guests can be recognized by their voice, their jewelry, or simply the company they keep, so the concealment works as a shared convention of the evening rather than a genuine method of hiding anyone's identity. For an unmarried woman at court, a ball is also an opportunity to be seen. Family fortune and social standing are, to a real extent, put on display through what she wears and how she carries herself in that room. Access to the Queen at night is graded by rank, and the grading is enforced in small, specific ways. A courtier wishing to enter a room where the king or queen is present does not knock. The custom at Versailles is to scratch lightly at the door with the fingernail of the left little finger until permission is granted, and some courtiers deliberately grow that nail long for the purpose. Ushers control the doors during the more public hours of the evening, admitting anyone properly dressed to watch the grand couvert or a ball from the sidelines, while restricting smaller gatherings to those the Queen has actually invited. As the night goes on and the Queen withdraws from the larger public rooms toward her own apartments, the number of people with any legitimate reason to follow her becomes very small. Her attending ladies, the guards on duty, a small circle of personal friends such as the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac, and family members of high enough rank that etiquette cannot exclude them. Her personal circle in later years also includes companions, such as the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, whose closeness to the Queen was noted by contemporaries at court and has been debated by historians ever since. When the Queen leaves the salons for the night, she does not simply walk out. She is escorted back toward her apartments by whichever ladies and guards are on duty, passing back through rooms she crossed in the other direction, dressed for company only a few hours earlier. Once inside her bedchamber, the evening's entertainment is followed by a different kind of ceremony, the undressing or coucher, which follows roughly the same logic as the morning dressing ceremony in reverse, governed by the same rules of rank. The Queen's Dame d'honneur, the highest-ranking lady of her household, ordinarily has the right to hand her the nightgown. But if a princess of the royal family happens to enter the room while this is happening, the Dame d'honneur cannot hand the garment directly to a woman who outranks her. She must first pass it to the first femme de chambre, who passes it to the princess, who then completes the task herself. Court memoirs describe at least one occasion when Marie Antoinette, as a young dauphine, stood undressed through several minutes of exactly this handoff, as one princess after another entered the room, removed her gloves, and took her place in the chain of rank before the nightgown finally reached the intended shoulders. She reduced much of this particular ceremony once she became queen, favoring a smaller and less formal process on most ordinary nights, though the underlying principle, that rank outranks convenience, continues to apply throughout her time at Versailles. The staff attending to the queen's bedchamber are organized into a clear hierarchy of their own. Above the ordinary chambermaid sits the première femme de chambre, or first chambermaid, who prepares the queen's clothing, cosmetics, and toiletries, and supervises the rest of the bedchamber staff. Jeanne-Louise Henriette Campan holds this post for years, becomes one of the queen's closest confidants, and later writes a memoir that remains one of the main sources for how this part of Versailles actually worked. Above her sits the Dame d'Atour, responsible more broadly for the queen's wardrobe, and the Dame d'Honneur, senior lady of the household, who oversees ceremonial duties such as the nightgown ritual. The wardrobe itself takes up 3 separate rooms, reflecting a rule that the queen is not meant to wear the same dress twice. Etiquette alone accounts for 18 pairs of scented gloves and 4 new pairs of shoes ordered every week, on top of the gowns arriving constantly from her dressmaker, Rose Bertin. Ordinary femmes de chambre handle the physical work of laying out linen, warming the bed, and preparing whatever the queen will need through the night. By the standards of a private household, the queen has almost no privacy at all. Her bedchamber, however elaborately decorated, functions as a semi-public room. Courtiers pass through it during the day, attendants remain in it overnight, and one servant customarily sleeps on a small bed at the foot of the queen's own bed, close enough to respond immediately if needed. It is in this same room, not a separate delivery chamber, that Marie Antoinette gives birth to her children, in the presence of the royal family, and enough courtiers and officials to formally confirm that the child delivered is genuinely hers, a precaution against the substitution rumors that had followed earlier queens of France. Even the most private fact of the royal marriage becomes a matter of state. For the first 7 years after the wedding, the marriage remains unconsummated, a situation serious enough that Louis XV has his grandson examined by a royal physician, and serious enough that Marie Antoinette's own brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, travels from Vienna in 1777, partly to discuss the problem directly with the king. Within about a year of that visit, the difficulty resolves and the couple conceives their first child. The fact that a monarch's brother-in-law would cross Europe to intervene in his sister's marriage shows how little of royal life, even its most intimate mechanics, is treated as belonging to the couple alone. Once the larger occasions are finished for the night, the palace's ordinary lighting is far more modest than a ball would suggest. Wax candles, the more expensive option, are burned in the apartments of the royal family and senior nobility and placed in wall sconces and on tables, while cheaper tallow candles light the servants' stairs and working passages, producing a noticeably worse smell and a dimmer flame. Reflection does much of the remaining work. Mirrors, gilded picture frames, and polished silver fittings scatter what light is available around a room, which is part of why the queen's and king's apartments, heavy with gilding and mirror glass, look brighter at night than the plain stone corridors connecting them. Candles are trimmed and replaced through the evening by servants assigned specifically to that task, and candle stubs too short to keep using are traditionally kept and either reused below stairs or claimed as a servant's personal allowance, a small but real form of income attached to an otherwise unpaid position. Comfort, and particularly warmth, is a constant problem regardless of how a room is lit. Versailles has well over 1,000 chimneys, yet the building remains famously difficult to heat. The rooms are large, the ceilings high, and the insulation minimal by any later standard, so an open fireplace, the only real heat source available, warms little beyond the small circle of people standing directly in front of it. Louis XV, decades earlier, moved his own bedroom to a smaller, easier-to-heat room for exactly this reason, and requested a ceramic stove for the old royal bedchamber, though the project was never carried through as planned. In the coldest winters, Courtiers describe wine left standing on a dinner table, developing a skin of ice before it can be drunk, and fireplaces that draw badly, filling entire apartments with smoke rather than heat, forcing occupants to leave their own rooms until the smoke clears. Louis XVI, as interested in practical mechanics as he is in locks, later introduces a redesigned chimney based on principles associated with Benjamin Franklin, then living in France as the American representative, in an attempt to reduce the smoke. For the Queen and her ladies, the more immediate solutions are the ones used throughout the building: layered clothing, quilted undergarments, warm drinks, and wall hangings switched from silk to wool for the winter months, wherever the budget and the season allow it. While the Queen occupies herself with cards, music, or company, the King's evening usually looks different. Louis XVI keeps a private forge and locksmithing workshop inside the palace, a hobby he pursues seriously alongside a craftsman named Gammon, and one he tries, not always successfully, to hide from the court, which regards manual metalwork as beneath a king's dignity. He and Gammon develop routines for moving the workshop's anvils in and out of the room without being noticed. The Queen's complaint about the hobby is practical rather than social. The work leaves the King's hands blackened, and he's been known to visit her rooms straight from the forge without washing them first, marking her furniture in the process. Louis XVI also keeps a hunting diary, and on days he does not hunt, the entry is often no more than a note about the weather, or nothing at all. Historians reading the diary against the political record of his reign have pointed out how often a day of real national crisis produced no comment from the king beyond the routine details of his schedule. His own version of the coucher still exists at the end of the night, but by his reign the full public version of these ceremonies, staged for a room of courtiers the way Louis XIV once held it, happens less often than it used to. Both Louis XV and Louis XVI are known to prefer retreating to smaller, less ceremonial private rooms whenever the day's obligations allow it. The King and Queen do not share a single bedroom in the way a modern couple would understand it. Their apartments sit on opposite sides of the palace's central block, laid out as near mirror images of each other. The King's 7 rooms toward the north courtyard, each named for a different Roman god, and the Queen's rooms toward the south gardens, each apartment built around its own bedchamber and each running its own full schedule of ceremony. By the etiquette of the court, the Queen does not enter the King's bedchamber. If he wants to see her outside of official occasions, he crosses to hers instead, and a discreet internal passage connects the 2 apartments so he can do this without walking back through the public rooms. Marie Antoinette's own bedchamber, in her state apartments, is where she sleeps on most nights, sometimes joined there by the king, sometimes not. In a letter from early in her marriage, she describes a typical evening: supper at 9, then waiting with her husband's aunts for the king, who usually arrives around 11:15. If he does not come at all, she goes to bed alone at 11. Later in her reign, she also keeps a smaller, more private apartment behind her official rooms, reach through a door hidden in the wall paneling, where she can withdraw from the formal side of court life, receive her closest friends, and spend time with her children. Even so, her main bed, and the bulk of her actual sleeping, stays in the grand, public-facing chamber for most of her years as queen. That same hidden passage will later become the route Marie Antoinette uses to escape an invading crowd in October of 1789, though on an ordinary night, years earlier, its only function is privacy. Security follows the same layered structure as everything else at Versailles. 12 bodyguards stand watch over the entrance to the Queen's apartments at all hours, day and night, in a room built specifically for that purpose. Beyond her door, the wider palace is covered on an ordinary night by a rotating detachment of the Garde du Corps, the King's mounted bodyguard, numbering around 60 men on duty at any given time, supplemented by the Cent-Suisse, a Swiss infantry regiment, and by household troops covering the exterior grounds and gates. These guards are recruited exclusively from noble families, trained as much for ceremonial precision as for combat, and organized into companies that rotate through several months of duty at Versailles before returning to their home regiments. Within their ranks, an elite corps of 24 men, drawn from the Scottish Guard and known as the Gardes de la Manche, are permitted to stand close enough to touch the king's sleeve. a position understood at court as the single highest mark of trust available to a soldier. Their presence is constant, but on a normal night largely unnoticed by anyone inside the private apartments. A soldier posted at a door, a patrol crossing a courtyard, nothing that interrupts a card game or a concert. By midnight, or later if there has been a ball, the public part of the evening at Versailles has mostly ended. The gaming tables are cleared, any extra chandeliers that were lit for the occasion have already been taken down for storage, and most of the several thousand people who work or live in the palace have gone to their own rooms, many of them in cramped quarters tucked into the building's upper floors and attics, a considerable contrast to the rooms they spend their days maintaining. In the Queen's bedchamber, the last stage of the couche is finished. Her hair is taken down and loosely braided for the night, her cosmetics removed, her formal gown exchanged for a nightgown and cap. A last candle may be left burning low or put out completely, depending on the night and the season. The servant assigned to sleep at the foot of the bed settles into place nearby. Whatever happened earlier that evening in the Hall of Mirrors, the card rooms, or at the supper table, the room Marie Antoinette finally sleeps in is small by comparison, plainer than most of the rooms around it, and, for the first time since the sun went down at 7, quiet. Outside, the guards remain at their posts for the rest of the night, and the palace that spent the last several hours on full display now holds, in most of its rooms, nothing more eventful than several thousand people asleep.